Happy New Year, and these are my top 5 reads of 2024. At number 5 is actually a series of books that I read this year called The Moontide Quartet. I love sci-fi fantasy books, and this is a classic high fantasy in the same flavor as like a Song of Ice and Fire. The basic idea is that there are these two landmasses in this world, and once every 12 years, because of these extreme tides that they have because of the moon, a land bridge is opened up and connects these two continents, and every time that happens, there is a large war between the major empires in both of these continents. Absolutely loved it. It's got everything that I love in a fantasy book. Intrigue, there's great romance, there's great like mysteries, and the magic is very fun. So if you like fantasy, highly recommend Moontide Quartet. The first book I think is called Mage's Blood. My fourth favorite book of the year is The 100-Year War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. This is obviously a very difficult read, but an important one for what is happening in the Middle East, starting last year and continuing obviously through all of this year. The major argument that Khalidi makes in this work is that Palestine is a clear example of colonialism, undertaken, I should say, by first powers in Europe and then the state of Israel. So really good work, especially as a helpful overview if before this year you weren't following the tensions and war and history in Palestine and Israel and Syria and that part of the world. So would highly recommend giving this a read. It's also relatively short for a work that is covering so many years. Number 3, and I'm cheating a little bit because I'm picking 2 books, again, another series, Stephen King's The Shining, and then the second book in that series, which is called Dr. Sleep. These books are so good. I just recently have come to Stephen King over the last couple of years. Still not my favorite of his. Pet Sematary is my favorite, but this work is so fascinating, and I'm a big fan of the Kubrick film, but this is a definitely different flavor of story about the sins of our past and whether we can overcome both our own weaknesses, the weaknesses of our families, and if redemption can actually be accomplished in the midst of all of these things and real evil existing in the world. Would highly recommend it. The Shining is great. I actually do think Dr. Sleep is slightly better, but you do have to read The Shining first to get there. If you're a fan of King and you haven't taken this up because you're like, I've seen the movie, I would strongly advise, please take it up. Both of them are extremely well. And actually, the movie Dr. Sleep is also very good and a much more faithful adaptation. So check it out. My number 2 book of the year is Exit West by Mohsin Hamid. It is closely tied to the 100 Years War on Palestine, not in direct retelling. It's not about specifically Palestine and Israel relations, but it is about the refugee experience in the world, and it uses this really wonderful, almost sci-fi element to talk about it, maybe magical realism. Basically, there's a city that is not named where our 2 main heroes live, and there's a war going on, and rebels are closing in on this city, and life is getting harder, and they make the incredibly difficult decision to flee the city. But in the midst of this, there are these invisible doors that just, not invisible, but these are doors that just show up, and it's all dark, and you can walk through them, and people disappear. And no one knows where they go. There's rumors that like people have written back, and they actually just go somewhere else in the world, but no one knows. And Hamid uses this device to kind of fast track a story that would take a really long time as far as immigrating and fleeing in different stages. Humanizes people through this suffering in like an really, I found, uplifting way. Obviously, this is all mired in tragedy, and none of this should be happening. But it does show some of the great virtue that comes out of these moments, as well as some really lighter moments. There's a little bit of a love story that's quite wonderful. Questions about finding family and found family. My number 1 book of the year, if you've been watching this channel, you can probably guess, but I've used 2 hands to get it up here. The Power Broker by Robert Caro. This is the story of Robert Moses, who was a civil planner and city planner in New York from basically about the 1920s all the way to early 1960s. And it is about exactly what the title implies, the use of power, and in this case, unelected power, in New York City specifically, in America generally. Robert Moses, who's the key character here, interacts with all of the major powers of his day, from Al Smith to Rockefeller to FDR, and it is obviously dense and very, very long, but Caro is such a great writer. And what this really does is it dispels the myth in American political lore that is still very strong, and I think is partly responsible for the election of Donald Trump, that if someone were able just to cut through all that red tape and could just get the government to do something, it would solve a lot of problems. And the Power Broker shows that not only does that not work, and that can also tend toward great harm. And yes, maybe some things can be accomplished, but also many people will be crushed under the wheels of that magnetic personality who wields that power. It's a wonderful book. I know look at how thick this book is. I know I'm going to read this at least one more time, maybe twice in my life. That's how good this book is. One of the best books I've ever read, especially best history books I've ever read. Brilliant. So glad I read this. I would also recommend, if you're going to do this, the 99% Invisible podcast did a read through with Roman Mars and Elliott Kalan that I found incredibly helpful and really fun to listen to. So that's available right now, and you should definitely read The Power Broker, my book of the year 2024. It's that big.